Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our fourth and final Inspiring Student Research webinar series. We are so grateful to our sponsors, the Library of Congress, BBVA Bank, and 400 Years of African American History and Culture Commission for the opportunity to work with you this semester. Couple quick announcements, and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Capozzola to get things going as we talk about people-to-people diplomacy. First thing, don't forget, we're down to a week here. Final assessments are due next Monday. Make sure you've accessed it, make sure you've read the instructions, make sure you've taken a look at the template. This is 40% of your final grade. No, you can't skip it. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. That's intentional. What you're doing, reminder, taking content you learned in the course. Remember, that can be history content, pedagogy, strategies. We want to leave this open, big, and broad intentionally. We want this to be useful for you and not a make work exercise. You're going to layer in at least one source from the Library of Congress. You can't have none. They don't all have to be from the library. If you want to combine maybe something from the library with something from your state historical society, go to town. And one active learning strategy. And I'm going to do a specific segment on that later in this hour. Now, if you need help, please reach out and ask. We're going to be hosting office hours this Wednesday from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. But if that day and time doesn't work for you, reach out to Ashley, give her some options. We have worked with people both in office hours and out of office hours. Most people leave feeling much better. Honestly, I think there's like 1 2-hour block this week where we're both locked into the same meeting. Beside that, pick a time. One of us can come meet with you and help you and make sure you're in a good spot. Now, I'll be honest with you, 11:30 next Monday night, we're both going to be asleep. But this week, we are happy to help you and happy to talk with you. So don't pass up that opportunity if you need it. Make sure when you're done, hit the turn in button. That lets your facilitator know, yep, I'm good to go. Final survey. This is really important for our funders here. That will be available tomorrow in the course because you had to wait till the end of the fourth webinar. Please submit it after you submit your final assessment. Deadline is Wednesday the 15th at midnight. Give yourself about 15 minutes for this one. It's longer. Most of our surveys are real quick, but there's a lot of more detailed questions that we need to ask to provide the report to the Library of Congress at the end of the program, and that's really important to get your responses. We will also, in the end, most of you are funded on scholarship in this program. We really, really appreciate those funders, and it's important that they hear from you, what you learned and how you're using it in your classroom. We want to make this as simple as possible. So on the 16th, we're going to send you out an uploader form. Literally, we're going to ask you to write a letter to one of the funders, the one who's designated for your program. We'll ask you to type up a letter, go to a website, fill out the form. Literally, what's your name, what's your state, upload the file, done. My suggestion, knock this out before winter break, then you don't have to worry about it. But just really a paragraph on telling us what you've learned and how you're using it is so important as we apply for funding opportunities in the future. Those get bundled, printed into a packet, and given in physical form to our sponsors. So they see your names, they see your work. All right, you know the drill here, excuse me. Question and answer box, live captioning's on, turn it off if it bothers you. Do the survey at the end to get your credit. We'll post the video, we've got the slides and the handout and the bib already up on Google Classroom. Ashley made a handy dandy handout to go with my segment later in the session. So feel free to grab that if that's helpful to you. It saves you from scribbling notes. All right, that's all I've got. I kept it under 4 minutes. So Dr. Capozzola, turning it over to you for people-to-people diplomacy. And then we're going to work back to talk about some active learning strategies. So thank you for joining us from New Orleans this evening.
All right, thank you. And yes, as Lynn mentioned, I'm joining you. This is, different background from usual. I'm joining you from New Orleans. I'm actually participating in an event tomorrow for the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attacks that's convening at the National World War II Museum. So greetings to those of you who are on the call from Louisiana. It's good to be down here visiting you and traveling again. That also means that the Wi-Fi might or might not cooperate, but Ashley's a good backup for us. So if anything goes wrong, I will let you know. Let me just say what we're going to do tonight, and then I'll hop into the PowerPoint. We're going to be focusing once again on another aspect of debate and diplomacy. That's been our theme through the semester, connecting that to primary sources that are in the collections of the Library of Congress. In September, we spent some time thinking about what is diplomacy and who is a diplomat. And in some ways, we're returning to that question here by looking at this concept of people-to-people diplomacy. And I'll say more about what that means as we get into the evening. In the last 2 months, we also focused on questions of debate, on sort of strategies and tactics within, for example, the civil rights movement and other social movements, about the politics of respectability. All of these things are going to come up again in our final session here in December. But I want to look at sort of 3 moments in American and world history. And what I'll do now is I will share my screen, and I will try to play from the current slide. And if anything goes wrong, please just let me know. And what I want to do this evening is focus on some of these guiding questions, right? How did individuals build bridges across nations in the 20th century? That sometimes they didn't wait for their countries to do the diplomacy, that they became diplomats themselves, making sort of connections across borders and sort of trying to kind of build bridges. But sometimes those bridges, they were not just building bridges, but also barriers where they felt that another country was doing something objectionable. And they might press their government to take actions through forms of sanctions, or individually might have chosen to undertake something, a private action called a boycott. We'll look at this in the context of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. And then we'll also look at research strategies and look at a whole range of different kinds of documents. The ones I chose for this month are ones, they're a little more sort of off the beaten path. This is not the diplomacy of the State Department and of ambassadors and consuls, but diplomats who really sort of, mattered in their own way. And they're also ones that I think often could be really accessible to high school kids, especially if they're preparing National History Day connections. They may be, they may not themselves have traveled much, but they may have a pen pal around the world. That's why we asked you that question when we started. They may have, some kind of connections to another part of the world through family if they're immigrants. They may have, sort of other ways in which they are participating in forms of diplomacy. And there's lots of local histories here that could be tapped for National History Day projects. But let me just start by defining terms a little bit and what we mean. People-to-people diplomacy, none of these have formal definitions, but by what we mean by this is sort of when individuals are taking actions to engage in what we might call foreign relations. That they are engaging with other countries. They're commenting on their own country's diplomacy and on the policies of some other country. Sometimes it is political forms of exchange. So you might imagine, one thing you might do in your school is figure out, does my town or some nearby city have a sister city, right, in another country? This is a big trend in the 20th century for sister cities. It's a form of kind of informal diplomacy that creates cultural connections between different countries without necessarily government action involved. Right. And you'll also hear me use the phrase tonight, non-state actors. By non-state actors, I mean basically people who aren't formal diplomats, right? They could be travelers, they could be business individuals, they could be sort of letter writers, they could be Peace Corps volunteers who are sort of sponsored by the government, but in many ways are also non-state actors. They could be missionaries. Right, there's all kinds of people who travel internationally, are engaging in a kind of diplomacy without actually being state sanctioned actors, right? And as you can probably guess by hearing that list of terms, that's also a much more diverse group of people, right? In terms of race, gender, age, culture, language, all the kind of axes, religion, all that you might think about. The third term you'll hear me talk about later in the hour is this idea of soft power. Right, and this is an idea in international relations that countries have power in the world that is not just their military force, right, or even in many ways their economic power, right, but it could be their cultural and social influence in the world, right, and sort of the individual actions of ordinary people can in fact actually be part of a country's state power, right. And so if you joined early, one of the questions that Lynn and Ashley asked is, did you ever have a pen pal when you were growing up, right? And my pen pal was a boy named Dexter Steele from Trinidad. And we wrote letters for a couple of years until we kind of, lost interest in it. And it was how I learned about Trinidad. It was a country I didn't really know very much about, and I learned about it, and I wrote a report on it when I was in, maybe fifth grade or so. And that was a kind of an important moment for sort of just an ordinary kid in understanding the world, right? And I hope on some level, right, Dexter got to learn a little bit about life in New York State from writing to me. And so I think that's kind of one very basic example for thinking about people-to-people diplomacy, right? And I want to start actually with another letter. And this is sort of a very famous letter. This is not in the collections of the Library of Congress. It is in fact not in any collection in the United States at all. It's a letter that's in the Russian State Archives, written by Samantha Smith of Manchester, Maine in 1983. Or 1982, the photos from 83, who at the age of 10 wrote to the Soviet premier Yuri Andropov soon after he was came into that position, a letter expressing her concerns about war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And she wrote to say, "Congratulations on your new job." Always a good way to start a letter, right? "I have been worrying about Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear war. Are you going to vote to have a war or not? If you aren't, please tell me how you are going to help to not have a war." Now, in some ways, this is an individual writing to a politician. That's pretty standard thing that we do. But notice she's writing to the politician in another country, in some ways engaging in diplomacy, becoming a diplomat in her own way. And if you are old enough to remember 1982 and 1983, you know the story. That Samantha Smith got an answer from Yuri Andropov. She was invited to the Soviet Union, and for a couple of years she participated in sort of people-to-people diplomacy in the early days of Glasnost and Perestroika, in a time when, or even before Glasnost, at a time when, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets were really quite strong, and so she was a real kind of figure in that. Tragically, actually died in 1985 in a plane crash and never got to really sort of grow into that role. But I think someone like her is a good way of thinking about sort of, who else can be a diplomat. And I want to go into 3 examples that were in the document packet and 3 examples in the readings that are instances where people tried to build bridges across nations, sometimes with government support, sometimes in defiance of government policy, and sometimes, sort of amplifying government policies as well. Right, so let's start with the first, which are the cherry trees in Washington. Right, and this picture from the Library of Congress collections, probably from about the 1930s, an early color photograph. If you've ever had the good fortune to be in Washington, D.C. in April, you know just how beautiful this is, and you know about the cherry blossoms and the festival that accompanies it, public celebrations that focus on several thousand cherry trees planted at the National Mall around the tidal basin, as you see here, right near the site of the Jefferson Memorial. That's the Washington Monument in the distance. And you may have a vague sense, even know that the trees were a gift from Japan. But I want to take a kind of deeper dive into that gift to kind of understand the motivations for it and the diplomatic work that it did, both at the time it was given and much later. Now, one of the things that we want students to do in history classes is to contextualize, right? To put things in context, right? And so when they encounter a fact, like cherry trees were donated to Washington, D.C. in 1912, they have to ask sort of what else was happening in American history, what else is happening in world history? That kind of question asking is in some ways the most valuable skill that we can ask our students to do. And of course, they will know that that cherry blossoms, or they can find out, right, and learn quickly, that cherry blossoms are very important in Japanese culture. And this can be a kind of crucial factor of understanding how these come together. They will also know, of course, that this is a time when the United States is fascinated by Japan, right? That there's a kind of interest in this country that had been closed to outsiders for so long, but is now open after Perry's expedition. And there's sort of cultural exchange, art exchange, like these woodblock prints by the famous artist Hiroshige, here, who you see here, a print of Mount Fuji in the distance and cherry blossoms here in the front. But we also know from world history classes or US history classes that Japan is also a rising power. That they had just won a war with Russia in 1905. They had acquired new colonies in Korea and Taiwan at the same time that the United States is expanding into the Pacific, acquiring new territories in Hawaii, in the Philippines. And so there's some real tensions actually between the two countries. And here's a slide that you probably didn't expect to see in a lecture on cherry blossoms. This is an image of the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 from an amazing collection by the photographer Arnold Genta, who worked in San Francisco for years, and his images are all in the collections of the Library of Congress. Now, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 devastated the city, closed many of the schools, and the San Francisco School Board, which for a long time had expressed concern about the increasing number of Asian students, Asian immigrant students who were in the schools, decided that in the wake of the earthquake, that students of Japanese ancestry would be assigned to schools that were reserved for non-white students. This, in fact, actually created a diplomatic controversy that almost brought the two countries to the brink of war. In the years around this, so strongly that, in fact, President Theodore Roosevelt launched the sailing of the so-called Great White Fleet, a big sort of sailing of US naval vessels from the Atlantic to the Pacific in order to send a signal of power to the Japanese government. Right? So there is a moment of tension. And that's, I think, the important takeaway in terms of contextualization. There's cultural interest in Japan, there's some exchange, but there's some real political tension at work. And it is in this context that civilians in Japan, not the government, not state actors in any sense, decide to send a gift of cherry trees from Japan to the United States. And it comes through an exchange from the city of Tokyo to the First Lady, who you see here, Nellie Taft, Helen Taft, the wife of William Howard Taft, who was president in 1912. And if you look on the resources from the Library of Congress, they did a great exhibit in 2012 for the 100th anniversary that gives you a kind of rich sense of the background. And in that, we saw one of the letters, which was in the packet, a letter from Gei Ozaka, who's the wife of the mayor of Tokyo, writing directly to Nellie Taft, expressing, sending the news that the cherry trees had been sent. In fact, the first batch of cherry trees that were sent all died, and so they sent another batch. And eventually they are planted, ultimately as many as 3,000, which were planted in Washington, D.C. A couple of them are still alive today, and if you're ever there, you should go and visit them and pay respects. But that she hoped would, quote, form an avenue in Washington as a memorial of national friendship between the US and Japan, right? And so notice that's diplomacy. Right? It is a form of diplomacy. Notice also who's doing it, right? These are people who are not government officials. They're obviously powerful people, the wife of the mayor of Tokyo, the wife of the US president, but they're also women, right? They're sort of engaging in sort of political action at times when those official positions would have been closed to them, right? So people-to-people diplomacy offer open space for sort of non-state actors and for people excluded from government positions to engage in foreign relations in really important ways. Now, of course, the cherry blossoms didn't stop World War II, right? And we know this, it was a token of exchange, but as tensions between the US and Japan increased in the 1930s, the cherry blossoms were sort of not enough. And I found this image from Chronicling America, and if you sort of look, but by the end of World War II, and at this point, if you look at the date, if you can see it at the top, March 26th, 1945, war is still happening in Europe, war is still happening in Japan. But this is the first sort of cherry blossom it's not a festival itself, because the actual festivals were canceled during World War II, but it's the first time that people are kind of walking around seeing the cherry trees, imagining that these might actually someday become symbols of peace and not of conflict. And of course, after World War II, the United States and Japan became very close allies in the Cold War. And those cherry blossom trees became a kind of symbol of a long history of shared bonds between the two countries. And in many ways, we have the thanks for that go not just to the leaders of the two countries, but to the ordinary citizens of the two countries who made those kinds of exchanges possible. Right? So there we have one example, right, of exchange, of people-to-people diplomacy, of non-state actors, kind of redefining diplomacy and trying to build bridges across nations at times when their own governments were very much in conflict. All right, so let's look at one more example. Okay? And this is the Peace Corps. Again, I wanted to pick an example that many people have heard of, but maybe haven't really kind of thought about, haven't put into context, or may not know really how they might teach about this in their own sort of classes. And this is a familiar organization if you know it. The Peace Corps was established in 1961. It sends American volunteers abroad for 2 or more years, where they are paid small stipends, and in exchange, they engage in some sort of useful work, usually useful instructional work, in another country. Generally speaking, countries in the developing world, right, or the global South. It was very much sort of designed to be sort of a volunteer organization that you have to join the Peace Corps, just like you would join the military or join some other volunteer undertaking. But it was also part of a government project and amplifies government concerns. So what I want you to think about as I talk about the Peace Corps is this is an example of people-to-people diplomacy that is not necessarily sort of state-oriented or controlled, but is very much in the interest of US foreign policy, right? I mean, this is a government agency. It's sponsored by the US government, and it's paid for by US tax dollars. But the individual volunteers have their own individual motivations, they have their own roles in going to the Peace Corps. And so in that sense, it's a balance between individual and collective efforts at diplomacy. So it was established in 1961, proposed by President John F. Kennedy, and administered, in fact, by its first director, Sergeant Schreiber, who was his brother-in-law. So the Kennedy administration, as you remember, was a very close family affair. And in fact, very soon after it was launched, it was an enormous publicity success. Thousands of volunteers signed up. It was, in fact, actually, sort of really competitive process to get some of the first slots in the Peace Corps volunteer program. It also drew on very long traditions in American history of volunteerism and humanitarianism. So, I wanted to show a slide here. As Lynn knows, I'm a big fan of posters from the First World War, and there's a huge collection of them in the Library of Congress. So even though we're not covering that in this class, I wanted to make sure that I got at least one poster in there before the semester was over. This is from an organization called the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, a volunteer organization that raised funds and sent volunteers as teachers, as nurses, as doctors, to Greece and to other parts of what was the Ottoman Empire in the wake of World War I. And of course, there's a long tradition of missionary service, people who go for religious reasons to serve abroad in teaching roles and other kinds of positions. So in some ways, the Peace Corps doesn't come out of nowhere. But in 1961, people understand that this is a new, more modern formulation of very old traditions in American political culture. Now, for some, this is a form of oh wait, let me go back to, let me just focus on this map first. For some, the Peace Corps is a form of what we might call soft power, a diplomacy that does not involve the exercise of military force or economic control, but influence in order to promote around the world positive images of the United States. And certainly that is one of the goals of the Peace Corps, that it obviously sought for the individual volunteers to be successful in their tasks, whether it was building a bridge or teaching English or mathematics in a school. But one of its bigger goals was a positive image of the United States that people would get by meeting Americans in the countries where they're traveling. And I wanted to spend a minute with this map, in part because we haven't looked at a map yet this semester. I love teaching with maps because they're just jam-packed with information and ideas. And they're just fun to let students kind of spend time deciphering. This map is from the second or third year of the Peace Corps program. We know it's from after 1963 because if you look at the bottom, the address for the Peace Corps includes a zip code in Washington, and zip codes were brand new in 1963. So it's relatively sort of new development, relatively early in the Peace Corps history that this map appears. And what I would do if I were teaching this, I would just let students try to identify the countries and let them ask and wonder why these countries and not others, right? So what's happening in the world at this time? What are the relations that the United States has with these countries? And one of the first things that we, depending on how much world history they're doing or how much background knowledge they have, they might understand that these are areas that in the 1960s would have been identified as, quote, developing, right? They might even have been labeled as the terminology emerged, the third world, right? As that term was used at the time, or more, as we use more likely today, the global South, right? And just to distinguish those two terms, they often refer to some of the same regions, but developing implies that you have somewhere to go and you're supposed to get there on their terms, right? You're supposed to become like Europe or like the United States. So some people don't like that term. And third world also, again, has a hierarchy implied in it. First world, meaning the United States and Western Europe. Second, meaning the Soviet bloc. Third world, the rest of the world. And so if we get away from hierarchy, we could say global South and global North, right? So these are global South countries for the most part. And so that's why the United States might be engaging in that, right? Why they might be sort of trying to address economic growth, economic inequality in these regions. They might also be countries where the United States wants to improve its image, right? And you may need to get into some of the background information of particular countries for why that might be the case. But this is the middle of the Cold War, right? It's 1963 probably that this map was made, right? And so students should be able to kind of identify, oh, it's the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union will be competing for the hearts and minds of these countries. And then you could ask them, is the Peace Corps a weapon in the Cold War? Right? Is it a form of soft power, a form of kind of cultural diplomacy? Is it a way of winning hearts and minds? Right? I've read a bunch of oral histories from Peace Corps volunteers who went to the Philippines, and one of them said, we are diplomats. He actually said that in his letters, and wrote back to say, we are an effective counterbalance to the offensive displays of the drinking of soldiers on R&R. Right. So they're trying to present a good image of the United States abroad to counteract sort of negative images. Right. And we could use, you could spend tons of time on this map, and maybe, in the Q&A, we can get back into specifics of it, how you would teach with it, and so forth. Right? All right. So we'll keep going. All right. So there were critics of the Peace Corps. One of them was President Richard Nixon, who took over after Kennedy and Johnson. And Richard Nixon said that the Peace Corps was a waste of money, and that in fact, the best way to improve developing countries was not to sort of send Americans to teach them to build bridges, but to basically, have them build bridges that would improve their economy. But it's also clear that Richard Nixon sort of resented the Peace Corps because it was so closely allied with his rival, John F. Kennedy. And so his efforts to kind of restrict this, were in part kind of personal battle between the two of them. But I think there is a sort of question, a broader question that Nixon identified of whether efforts like this actually aid the people that the United States claims to be helping. And this was an issue in, among other places, the Philippines, one of the sort of places that I had studied, where it was one of the first places that American Peace Corps volunteers went and they arrived to serve as teachers. And in fact, this created some tension in the Philippines when Americans arrived to become teachers, because there was no teacher shortage. In fact, it was hard to get a job as a teacher in the Philippines. There were, sort of more people being trained as teachers than there were jobs available to them. And this created some real resentment when the Peace Corps volunteers, many of them not actually trained as teachers, were taking jobs from Philippine teachers themselves. And so there were definitely, people who were opposed to U.S. presence in their countries in the 20th century, who might have, scrawled things like "Yankee Go Home" on walls like this. This is the cover of a collection of anti-American songs collected by the Smithsonian Folkways project over the years. And one of the things that this project did is it sort of, or that opposition did, is it often focused on the Peace Corps volunteers because they represented the United States, often in very rural parts of all kinds of countries around the world. They often became flashpoints of controversy, and in fact actually could become sort of targets of opposition or even of suspicion. So one of the other letters I read from a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines wrote back to say he was shocked to learn that everyone in the village assumed he was a spy for the CIA. And he had sort of gone, he went off there to sort of create goodwill for the United States and realized that he actually had a lot of work to do to convince people to kind of change their minds. So the Peace Corps, has this long history. It participates in the soft power of the United States. It is part of government action, but the individual volunteers themselves are sort of, in many ways, individual diplomats, engaging in people-to-people diplomacy as they are individually teaching, building, engineering, doing healthcare work, all the kind of stuff that Peace Corps volunteers do. And some of you, there may even be some people on the call who were Peace Corps volunteers. And if you are, I hope you'll pipe up in the Q&A with some of your experiences and reflections on that. All right, so what I want to do now is actually kind of take a second and move to a quick poll. And I'm going to come back to all of these different kinds of questions. We've talked about people who've traveled outside the United States as exchange students, as tourists, as Peace Corps volunteers, as missionaries, and how this might sort of change US foreign relations and Americans' attitudes toward people in other countries. And I want to give you this quote. This is from Mark Twain. All good quotes come from Mark Twain eventually, when you trace them back to their roots. But this is one. At one point, Mark Twain said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." All right, so I want you to just think about this for a second and think about the idea of travel as a form of diplomacy, whether it's individual tourism, whether it's organized study as a student, whether it's travel for religious purposes as a missionary, as a volunteer on a humanitarian undertaking, as a cultural exchange group, sort of exchanging trees with your sister city in some other part of the world, as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so think about that, and then we're going to give you a poll. Okay.
All right,
So
here's your chance.
What do you think? Is Mark Twain correct that travel is, quote, fatal to prejudice? So we'll spend I think a minute, I think you have, but not too long. So don't think too much. Just read it and go with your gut.
Right, we got 60% response. Go ahead, drop those answers in. Give it a couple more seconds. Again, don't overthink it. Oh, we just broke 80%. All right. Last chance, put it in. All right. Response, 61%, excuse me, 61% said yes, 9% said no, 30% said maybe it depends.
All right. So thanks. So yes, so a slight majority, right, think that if people traveled to other countries, there would be more understanding and less conflict, but not everybody agrees. And some people are not so sure. So let's see in the Q&A sort of where people, where people landed on that. All right, so let me keep moving and spend a little bit of time on the next third of the case studies that I want to look at, which is the anti-apartheid movement that were global, but that also took place in the United States, particularly in the 1970s and the 1980s. In this case, I want to start by just some background. This is a poster from a group it's actually based in, the artist is based in California. The group is based in Washington, D.C., that was doing work sort of against the apartheid policies of South Africa, and developed a series of posters and graphic art, which is in the collections of the Library of Congress. And if you follow the trails in the source packet, you'll be able to find a whole bunch of posters that look sort of like this and really kind of interesting ones. So just as a background for this, right? So South Africa, after 1948, adopts a policy of apartheid. It's Afrikaans word for apartness, separation. That was a formal legal system of segregation that pervaded every single aspect of South African life, in some ways more totalizing than U.S. segregation policies of the 20th century, that was also endured much longer. In fact, persisted long after civil rights movements had challenged those in the United States and other Western countries. Apartheid as a government policy also becomes part of, or opposition to apartheid becomes an international popular movement, one that both draws on the US civil rights movement and also expands it and complements it and brings in a range of different people and actors who are engaging in efforts to try to get their own countries, whether it's the United States or New Zealand or Sweden or England, to pressure the South African government to change its policies around race, and among other things, to sort of end the apartheid system and make a transition to full democracy that encouraged all adult South African citizens to vote. Now, many of these calls asked for boycotts, right? And so I wanted to just spend a second to ask us, well, where does this term come from, right? And in fact, actually, it comes from Ireland in the 1870s and the 1880s. Where a series of popular movements against sort of exorbitant rents that Irish farmers were experiencing and paying to absentee English landlords led to a popular movement not to pay them, right, and to not to patronize the businesses of the people who were enforcing them. Now, one of the people enforcing those rent payments was a guy by the name of Charles Cunningham Boycott, who was an Englishman living in Ireland. And he wasn't a rich landowner. He was the kind of an enforcer, the tax collector, the rent collector, literally. But basically, he and all of his businesses were sort of blackballed by Irish people, and they ended up calling it a boycott. Right. So it's one of those terms, it's a word that we use all the time, but we don't even necessarily know its origins. But I also want to just, in terms of terminology, distinguish it from sanctions, right? So when we talk about economic sanctions, those are usually official actions imposed either by one country, like the United States, or by the international community, whether it's the UN, the EU, et cetera, that sort of formally prohibit trade, travel, other kinds of sort of official things that governments control, right? So it could say that no one can go to this country. No one from this country can come to the United States, right? No one can buy or sell things from this country, right? So sanctions are government actions. But when governments are not exerting sanctions, individuals might call for a boycott, right? Sort of, this is a form of people-to-people diplomacy. It's harsh. It's not sort of planting cherry trees, right, and writing letters to your pen pal, right? This is designed to kind of put pressure on another country by boycotting its goods, by boycotting events that it sponsors, etc. Now, for years in the United States and other countries, there had been pressure on the US government to impose sanctions on South Africa, but formal sanctions were not forthcoming. They were not forthcoming from Democratic presidents like Jimmy Carter or Republican presidents like Ronald Reagan, in part, or from the Congress, whether it was controlled by Republicans or Democrats, in part because South African government was a close US ally during the Cold War and controlled enormous natural resources, particularly gold, diamonds, and uranium, which is of course important in the Cold War. And so the US government found it very difficult to consider imposing formal sanctions on South Africa. But that did not stop sort of individuals and social movements from calling for boycotts of South African sort of businesses, but also of US businesses that were engaging in trade with South Africa, promoting South African products, et cetera. And so this poster you see from that same organization, is sort of really kind of calling for, in this case, a boycott of Del Monte fruit production. That of course, South Africa being in the Southern Hemisphere was able to produce fruit in what would be the winter in the United States. Far more of South African goods went to Western Europe than to the United States, but some did go to the United States. And just in case anyone from the Del Monte Corporation is listening, this Del Monte did eventually sort of divest from South Africa in the 1980s, just for the record. But this poster from 1977 is calling for them to do that. So as this is happening, what we can also see is this is in many ways a kind of crucial chapter. Oh wait, let me just talk about a couple of other movements, right? There are also movements that focus on leisure and consumer culture, right? Sort of in the soft power that South Africa was itself trying to exercise in the world in order to kind of give itself a better name and deflect attention from its racial politics. There were efforts to get people to not buy South African goods, not to travel to South Africa, and also to discourage performing artists and others from traveling to South Africa to perform or to sort of make money through the sale of their products, their books, their music, et cetera, in this time period. Now, along the way, one of the sort of big international sort of casino resorts that were developed in South Africa, in the world, really, one of the biggest ones, was a place called Sun City, just outside Johannesburg, and which was built in the early 1980s and made a sort of big splash by getting very big name international artists to come to South Africa and to perform at the Sun City Casino. And in 1985, a very wide group of artists from around the world joined a group called Artists United Against Apartheid, and had a song called Sun City, right, in which they all basically in their song itself committed to not performing at Sun City or in South Africa until the end of apartheid. In the image you see here, you can see Bruce Springsteen on the left, and then two members of the Temptations, David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks, along there. And the song is, those of you who are older on the call may remember it. You might have it on a cassette tape somewhere in your house. The song is sort of great, sort of bit of 80s kind of music, sort of pop culture that is very sort of teachable. But we can see sort of artists and also the consumers of music participating in boycotts, right? And sort of saying like, understanding the role of cultural diplomacy, not only in sort of building bridges, but also building barriers against the apartheid state. Now, of course, this also plays out in sport, and the South African government put a lot of time and a lot of effort into kind of sending its athletes on international trips, but sport in South Africa was rigidly segregated. Audiences, spectators in the stands, as well as athletes on the field. And really only white athletes were allowed to go on international trips. And of course, many sort of multiracial sports teams were reluctant to compete in South Africa in front of segregated audiences, right? Or ones that in fact may have excluded Black South Africans altogether. So sport becomes a kind of crucial kind of turning point for cultural boycotts, including, and this is one of the optional readings, the blog post about an international rugby tour that South Africa tried to sort of go, the South African team attempted to go on in the 1980s and really faced a kind of increased opposition around the world, including in the United States. Rugby obviously isn't a big sport in the United States, but there was sort of opposition to it very much along the way. Now, one of the things I wanted to highlight is sort of how this fits into kind of the history of and how we teach about the US civil rights movement, which in many ways we teach about as a domestic political enterprise focused on the transformation of US law. But if you read through the pamphlet in the kind of the document packet for this month, the NAACP documents in many ways that they had been sort of working on global issues and South African issues ever since the beginning. And I think that thinking about the anti-apartheid struggle as part of the concerns of the US civil rights movement can really kind of help us see that this is actually a global undertaking. Right now, the image that I show here is from it's from Detroit in 1998. It's a sort of folk artist who just put a mural on a sort of auto body shop, actually, and it's designed to be a mural of Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, kind of putting U.S. and South African sort of political leaders into a kind of global sort of Black political movement. It's from a collection by a photographer by the name of Camilo Vergara, who has documented cities all around the United States, particularly Detroit. And those collections are in the Library of Congress and really great and good to teach with. And in many ways, the anti-apartheid movement is a continuation for many people in the US civil rights movement of work they had already been doing. And at the same time, it's designed to kind of say, this is not over. Right. And if you think about it, the civil rights movement is happening in the 60s and the 70s. It's sort of continuing. And by the 1980s, it's not that long after. Right. And they're sort of trying to dismantle formal segregation and exclusion from the vote in South Africa very soon after they are fighting those same battles in the United States. Right. And African Americans have a crucial role in the anti-apartheid movement itself, right? Particularly in the United States. And if you kind of go through this, the pamphlet that you can download from the Library of Congress website, you get a kind of real sense of how political leaders have a crucial role to play in connecting U.S. civil rights movement to anti-apartheid movements abroad. And many of these, at the same time, they also complement and change some of the other movements, right? So of course, white Americans play a kind of key role in the anti-apartheid movement as well. And some of those are white Americans who had been allies of the civil rights movement, participants in it in the years before that, and saw opposition to apartheid as very much at peace with that. But some were sort of new to this, coming from emerging movements for human rights and kind of that emerged in the 70s and 80s. And there were people who asked, well, where were you when we were fighting segregation in our country? Right? Why are you so interested in segregation in South Africa when you could work on something here right at home? Right. And so, the anti-apartheid movement is on one level something everyone could agree with. And it was a very unifying kind of social movement of the 1980s. But it did raise questions about sort of what work remained left to be done to dismantle racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. And of course, we know, that this, this participates, and contributes to the end of apartheid. You see here on the left, South African President F.W. de Klerk, who was responsible for the release of Nelson Mandela from 28 years of imprisonment. And eventually beginning the process starting in 1990, ending in 1994, that led to a multiracial democracy in South Africa. And in his speeches when he traveled to the United States and elsewhere, Nelson Mandela was very clear. And he said, thank you for the boycotts. Thank you for sanctions. They worked. And in the South African case, there's pretty clear evidence that they did. that the pressure of both informal boycotts and formal sanctions created enough cultural that it forced the hand of the white South African government. And of course, popular social movements by South Africans made a difference too. But that's one example where we know that they work. Scholars disagree about whether boycotts work or not. As with the cherry trees, as with the Peace Corps, as with anti-apartheid boycotts, they may or may not work. But diplomacy doesn't always work either, right? And military force doesn't always work either, right? And so just just sort of saying, oh, boycotts don't work is not an argument against them. They're also ones that show up in the news all the time across the political spectrum, and we can expect them in 2022, because of course there are debates right now about those who call for the United States or its athletes to boycott the 2022 Olympic Winter Games in China to protest human rights policies, particularly in the Xinjiang and Tibet regions. And these will be sort of questions that will be in the news next year, and that we could really do our students a favor by teaching about them. But whether they work or not, I think they are just an important way to kind of think about how people in the past thought about the world, how they were out there, how they were building bridges or barriers to people that they would never know or meet, and how they were in many ways sort of engaging in debate and diplomacy. And with that, I'll stop.
All right. Well, I love the fact that you started talking about the Olympics, because that's going to be my nice little bridge here. I am a huge fan of the Olympics. I'm like really a nerd about it. And I think when we talk about active learning strategies, we got to think about the Olympics here, because the Olympics, while they're really cool, and I found some neat images in the Library of Congress, the first Olympic ice hockey team from the United States, the fact that Hawaiian swimmer and surfer Duka Hanamoku actually was in 3 different Olympic games and set all kinds of swimming records. But I think the Olympics have a danger, right? And it's that armchair couch danger. Watching somebody do this, you're like, I can totally do that. I can swim that far. I could run that fast. And then you go outside and you're like, okay, really, maybe I can't. But I think what we have to do with our students is to think about active learning strategies where they're actually doing and testing and trying. So what I wanted to do is show a couple of my favorites to hopefully give you some ideas if you're stuck for your final assessment. All right, first off, I mentioned earlier, Ashley made a super easy handout. So if this helps you, grab it off of Google Classroom, save yourself writing some notes. I think we've got to get our students asking questions. And I think sometimes we start talking and we get excited and we forget to stop. Very simple, effective strategy I found. I stop and say, okay, nope, I'm not moving on until we have at least 3 good questions. And be prepared the first time you do that to stand there for at least a minute. Once students start, give that processing time. You'd be amazed what they come up with. If you're looking for something more formal to help teach your students questions, check out the Right Question Institute and some of their resources that they're creating with the Library of Congress. They've got some good stuff there. If you're like me and you're sick and you got to get students asking questions, but maybe you have a terrible headache, not that that ever happens as a teacher, use the strategy of chalk talk. For a set period of time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes for middle schoolers, maybe 20 to 30 for high schoolers, no one is allowed to say a word. They've got to study or work on something, but when they have a question, they can't raise their hand. They walk up to the board and they write it on the board. Other students can walk up and answer. You can go on and respond, but no one's allowed to talk. That helps the students who are working independently be able to continue working. And again, different lengths of time. Great simple strategy pulled from my high school English teacher. Also, reword questions. Have a question of the week or question of the unit. When a student asks a really good one, put it up on the board, put their name on it, keep it up there for a couple days or a week or two. Get them thinking what good question they're going to ask to help get their name on the board. All right, next strategy I love to use in questions is short, small, roving discussion circles. So think of these as small groups, 3 to maybe 5 students each. Short bursts of discussion. This can't go on too long, 10 to 15 minutes max. Again, shorter end for younger students, longer end for older students. Rotate students as you need to. Literally tell them as you're talking, if I go around and tap you on the shoulder, you're going to move to another group. They don't know who's going to move where. That lets you help spread out and keep good discussions going and keep discussions from getting stale. Rotate leaders. Start, okay, everybody who faces the window starts off as a leader. No, we're going to switch to everybody who faces the board in the circle. Mix it up. Start by giving them some questions to get them started, but then let them generate more. Oftentimes in smaller groups, your more reluctant students are much more open than they are to open up in a whole group discussion. Third strategy, I used to use this a lot with my lower level students. I called it a 1-block project. So I was teaching in a 90-minute block format. So this is a short task, something that lasts somewhere between 45 and 90 minutes. It's a project that combines a little bit of research with a specific skill and a product. All of that is self-contained. You've got to get it done in the short period of time. Keep the options simple and have whatever materials you need ready to go, so there's no time wasted on that. Simple question: was Andrew Carnegie a master of enterprise or a robber baron? You've got to have 2 images, 3 pieces of evidence to support your opinion, and I need to see what sources you got them from. Here's a piece of poster board, here's some markers, here's some scissors and glue. Go, it's due in 90 minutes, I'll come around and help you. So simple, quick ways for students to demonstrate their learning in ways that project-based learning doesn't always last weeks or months. Scaffolding knowledge visually. This is something I really had to come to as a teacher because I'm not a real visual thinker. But the more I realized how many of my students needed to see those visuals, think about making the historical thinking process visual, either because you give them the images and have them do the writing, or reverse, you give them the steps and you have them come up with the images, or you potentially do both. So I thought about the example we were looking at last month. We were talking about how did the NAACP's role help to reduce incidents of lynching? Well, okay, looking at what's the picture, but then what's the caption? How are ways that the NAACP is working in order to get the result that we saw? And why is this working? So essentially, they're giving evidence, but they're providing visuals, because we know if we put words with a visual, you're more likely to remember it and process it and understand it. One other strategy, give students choice whenever you have the option. I tend to be a writer. I like to write things down. Some kids will fight you on writing, but if they can speak it, that's fine. So say, okay, you need to answer this question, but you have the option to either give me 1 paragraph or 100 words or 200 words, or a 1 or a 2-minute recording. They can do that very easily. They can use their cell phones. They can use their computer. There's tons of easy, simple, honestly, my niece in kindergarten was doing this with her kindergarten teacher last year. They had to create something and they had to explain their picture. The tech is easy. It also gives you a break. You can listen to them as you do other things like clean up your classroom or reset the boards, and make sure you're hearing what they're saying. Another one for those who may not have great artistic skills like me, stick figure political cartoons. When you try to do something with drawing, there's an anxiety piece for those kids who can't draw. And let's be honest, some of us just can't. Take the drawing element out. Tell them to draw a stick figure cartoon representing the views of Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The figures have to be stick people. Take the art out of it. Focus on the symbols, the images, what the stick figures have to say and how they're interacting with each other. Then add a layer. So a lot of times they'll have like 2 characters going back and forth at it. Then say, okay, you know what? I want you to add 2 more figures to your drawing. What are other perspectives or points of view that maybe we don't see so much? Excuse me, y'all. My goal here is to help throw ideas out at you, to throw different tools in your toolbox. I'm sure you use some of these, but I'm hoping I gave you 1 or 2 new ideas that you might want to try, either as you push through the last days before winter break or as you're coming back in the spring. All right, we did it. It is 7:58, and I am so proud of our team for knocking this out and getting this done within the hour. We are going to go ahead and shift to some questions. I know we've got a couple good ones in the queue, but before we do that, grab your pen real quick, tinyurl.com/NHD, National History Day, -ISR, Inspiring Student Research 21. That's your link to give your quick feedback, and we'll use that to get you credit for doing the webinar this evening. We'll get those posted tomorrow morning. So now you've got a chance to have that written down. I know we've got some good NHD questions, some good content questions. So Ashley, take it away.
Well, before I do that, I'm going to shamelessly plug 2 things, Lynn. One, if you want to know more about the history between the U.S. and Japan, head on over to nhd.org/themes theme and download a copy of our theme book, there is an article from the National Museum of American Diplomacy that actually does look at a dinner plate that also served as diplomacy between Japan and the United States. And also, it's a nice plug for Dr. Capozzola as well. If you're interested in learning more about humanitarian efforts, especially following World War I, we actually did a webinar on that as part of our World War I webinar series. And you can find that on our YouTube channel. And it talks about all the different ways the US participated in humanitarian efforts, both during the war and later on. And it also will give you a different perspective on Herbert Hoover. And it's a very interesting one because he doesn't come off as a bad guy this time. So those are my two shameless plugs if you're looking for more on those topics. But now I'm going to dive into Q&A. And our first question is from Stacy. She says, can diplomacy be as simple as peacefully coming in to some form of compromise, even if it is two groups within the United States? Thoughts?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. From an NHD perspective, keep in mind, diplomacy is about negotiation. It's about give and take. We think of it in the context of nation to nation, but it's often in the context of Republicans to Democrats, to farmers, to business interests, to, upper class, lower. It's all about negotiating. So for History Day, don't forget that what I keep calling is small d diplomacy, right? Ways that we interact and compromise. So that's my NHD answer. Dr. Capozzola, give us the history answer.
The history answer is the same, right? That, yeah, the answer is yes. And that, I've given examples here tonight of diplomacy in the sense of foreign relations and foreign affairs. But of course, diplomacy in a general sense is a way of being in the world, right? That often is about negotiation, about compromise, about listening and sort of recognizing, sort of the person or
group
that you're engaging with. I'll also say that there are people who actually think that that's part of the problem, right? And so there's a movement in the 20th century for the codification of international law, right, around all kinds of things, whether it's about trade, whether it's about migration, about human rights, who say, the problem with diplomacy is everybody gets in the room and, and they split the difference. But there are some aspects where you shouldn't split the difference, right? Things that should be sort of formalized as terms of international law, which is different from the negotiation and compromise that is at the heart of diplomacy in many ways.
Yeah. Wow. And if you're interested in learning more about those types of diplomacy that both Dr. Capozzola and Lynne have mentioned, I recommend checking out the National Park Service article in our theme book. They actually look at those from the perspective of how do debates, such as in labor unions, involve a level of diplomacy. So if you're looking for those types of topics, head on over to that theme book. Yes, I'm going to push it. All right. So
let me throw out one other thing too. If you're working with students on projects right now, a lot of times students get into their project on the debate end. But now that they've gotten through a good chunk of their research, this would be a good time to sit them down and go back to those two definitions and say, well, is there diplomacy or is there lack of diplomacy or undiplomatic action? Because now that they understand their content, I'll bet you they'll be able to point out some things that might help them flesh out their argument and their connection to the theme a little better at this point of the year.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then the next one is for Dr. Capozzola. Maureen would like to know, did divestment work?
That's a good question. The African National Congress, which was the sort of leading sort of political organization among Black South Africans and supporters of democracy in South Africa, and of which Nelson Mandela was the titular head when he was imprisoned and the actual head when it became a political party after 1990, or an unbanned political party after 1990. If you ask them, their answer is yes. That the combination of boycotts by individual citizens but in particular sort of formal sanctions by governments that made it hard for the sort of white minority in South Africa to travel, to take money out of the country, to access international goods, that those kinds of things did actually turn the tide. And that is, and I think that they're correct. I think historians generally agree with that. And there is one of the nice things that the ANC did after it took power in 1994 is open the archives to the apartheid era. So we actually know a great deal about what the white South African government was thinking, and they thought about sanctions all the time. Now, sanctions were more effective because they were just the power of the state. But I don't think that those ever would have been imposed without popular movements calling for them, right? So we need to, in some ways, the boycott, an individual saying, I'm not going to buy this product because I don't believe in its values, probably that won't affect the bottom line all that much. But it's the collective effort of it, on any political or social issue that sort of adds up to it, especially when it then forces the hand of government action. So it's a kind of a back and forth. But there are, of course, also critics of sanctions who say often they hurt the people, that they're trying to help. That was a critique of sanctions from the time period. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, for example, was virulently opposed to sanctions against South Africa, her argument being that it would kill jobs, and particularly jobs for the poorest people in South Africa. And the ANC and others sort of said, this is a necessary battle in the war, but there are arguments against sanctions as well.
So if anyone is interested, dive more into that. But I'm excited to say that actually clears our queue for the night. Unless someone is sneaking in a final question, I'm giving you 10 seconds to hit enter, even if the question isn't finished, so I know it's coming in.
Well, I'll just take 10 seconds while people are typing to say that the Olympics makes a great, it's just a great research topic. And, and part of the reason I wanted to kind of work sports in general is you can kind of hit, many students who don't have historical sensibilities about the world in general do actually have historical sensibilities about sport. And it can be a kind of entry point for a lot of people. And then they realize, oh, there are these bigger issues at work. And obviously the Olympics just brings up Cold War issues and so many issues. So thanks to Lynne for guiding us into that.
All right, wow. For those of you who don't have kids, who don't have topics, the Olympics has many of them. And I think you have 2 people that would agree that that's a great place to start. But for all of that, it looks like that wraps up our questions, but feel free to keep sharing those stories in the Q&A box. So thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, first off, thank you to all of the teachers and coordinators who have put time into this program and thought and effort. We appreciate you and all the things that you're doing in a really challenging semester, and we're excited to wrap this course and get you your PD hours and your credit as is appropriate. And I cannot leave without a big thank you, BBVA Bank, 400 Years of African American History Commission, and the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program for creating the funding opportunities to not only create and nurture this class, but to get to so many teachers, not just across the country, but around the world. So a big thank you to them. All right, we are going to go ahead and wrap there. This is our final in our fall 2021 webinar series. So a big thank you to Dr. Chris Capozzola from MIT and my colleague Ashley at NHD for all of the hard work you all have put in. And that's all we're going to end with tonight. Have a wonderful night and good luck. We'll see you with NHD 2022 project. So have a great night.
Bye, everyone.